Hi there, Liron here, and in this lesson we'll learn how to simplify the shapes and details of our reference. Now, an important element of that is actually simplifying the drawing stage, which is something we'll focus on with this one, because what you want to do is already in the drawing stage establish very clear and simple shapes. Now, this has a couple of things to it. One is the number of main shapes you represent. So how far can you push it? Can you just create 1, 2, 3 shapes, maybe sky, land, and a few details, and then within those shapes, how much you simplify their details, their outlines, and all of the little things that go into them. So I'm going to show you how it's done. Let's get started. Okay, so I will focus greatly on the drawing stage because remember, this is the stage that will dictate how much we can simplify the shapes and the details. So if you look at the reference, it's actually made for that purpose. It's beautiful in that regard. By the way, what I'm doing is marking the main spots I see, so that tower, the edge of the building, and so on. But look at what happens next. I take the entirety of the background and I turn it into just one shape. I'm basically drawing its outlines and that's it. And that right here is the magic trick, quote unquote. When people wonder, how do I simplify the shapes? That's the main way I do it. I only focus on the outline. And believe it or not, if you put enough details in the outline, it will read very well. Now, sometimes you may need to draw some of the details inside just to get things accurately. And that's perfectly fine. Do whatever you need to, but always think about it in terms of simple shapes. And look at this one. We have one shape for the background, one shape for the water, one shape for the sky. If you want to count it, it's just the background to me, and the gondolas, which are going to be, again, simplified shapes. You will see in a few moments once I start placing them in. But this is really where the magic happens. Now, the real neat trick is if you draw the outline interesting enough, that's all the information you see. Now, some people have trouble with figuring out what the shapes are. Am I gonna do one shape for the buildings, one shape? What am I gonna use, and how do I decide what shapes I'm gonna use? And it's very easy to me, especially with that kind of reference photo. You have a very clear value scheme. If you squint your eyes or take a few steps back, you will see that the entirety of the background is of a very similar value. You can see some variation. There are some darker warms in there, but for the most part, look at the values. It's just one shape. Now look at the sky. Again, if you squint or if you use the posterize feature I introduced you to in a previous lesson on digital simplification, you will see it just will flatten it out into one shape. Look at the sky. It's just one very similar value. And yes, there is some variation of color and value, but that's it. Look at the gondolas. It's basically every gondola is made of maybe two shapes, one for the darks and one for those highlights. And that's it. And look at the shadow. It's the same value as the gondolas themselves. So you can connect the two. And that's what it's all about. Now, you may have trouble because drawing it accurately is the thing that challenges you. That's fine. That makes sense. But if you just look at the entirety of the scene, you will be surprised at how beautiful of a painting you can produce with very little drawing knowledge, because you chose the right shapes to simplify, because things are in the right spot. And you're going to get this aha moment, hopefully, once I put in the gondolas at a later stage, because then you'll realize the accuracy of the shape sometimes is not nearly as important as the overall impression of the scene. It's not nearly as important as just getting things in the general right spot, in the general correct and clear value, okay? So a few words about this wash, the first wash. This is where you can really let go. What I decided to do is use basically two mixtures, very organic and very non-singular paint-based, to just get a general feel of sky and water, where the sky is slightly blue, mixed in with some yellow, with some reds, very organic. And the ground and everything else is warm, mixed in with some blue and some red. Very organic again. It's only a question of what the dominant color is. Now this wash is going to cover everything up with a very light consistency, so something like tea, okay, very watery, a lot of movement on the palette, with the one exception of the highlights. And where are those highlights? On the water surface,
and on the gondolas. And that's pretty much it for the first wash, okay? It's a very simple one. Don't get too caught up in specific colors. Don't worry about creating the same mixes of colors. Divide your palette into warms and cools and use them freely. Now, one big trick that helps, and it will achieve two goals. One, you will simplify, and two, you will get a more natural feel, is to always keep your colors mixed. Don't just use pure blue. It's very rare to see pure blue. Don't just use pure yellow. It's very rare to see these. This is a very common amateurish mistake, to just use clean colors as they are from the pens, because these colors are very rarely seen in nature like that. It's usually artificial. Usually product wraps will have these very unified one color, okay? So by doing this more organically, by including some reds and yellows in your blues, very gentle, you will provide a more organic feeling for the viewer, okay? Now, as for this next stage, I took a few minutes to let everything dry fully. This is not wet and wet, this is fully wet on dry. Okay, and what I'm doing now is establishing that background wash. Now, don't be fooled by how dark it seems. This is just because there's a lot of water and it's all bunched up in one spot. You see, once I'll spread it out, you'll see how the color becomes the value becomes much lighter. And remember, we established the background as one shape. So how am I treating it in the painting stage? Is one big shape. And you will see there are some windows, there are some gaps. I missed those, and that's perfectly fine. You will see me bringing them back on by adding the just some white opaque paint. Okay, so we will get these on. Now remember what I said. Keep the number of shapes small, but the outlines interesting. And as long as the outlines are interesting, people will read them properly. So for example, on this left-hand side, we have all of these trees. I'm just putting in some blurry shapes for them. I used my water sprayer just to move and spread the paint out a bit, but then you see all of these poles, all of these, the details on the outline of the building. All of these are what is required to create a sense of realism and interest in the shapes. That's what it's all about. Don't be fooled by any need to add too many details. Again, look at this as layers. One layer is the sky, another layer is the entirety of the background, and another layer is going to be the water and the gondolas. And that's it. And if you paint it as one shape, just treat it as one big shape, you will be able to simplify. So if, again, you're after simplifying the shapes and the details, that's how you treat it. Think about the entirety of the scene in terms of how can I represent this in just 3 shapes. It may be difficult. There may seem to be too many details. You take a few steps back physically from the scene, from the photo, just look at what you see. And by the way, I'm going to include this very quick tip for plein airs. Sometimes when you're outside and you want to paint something like this simplified plein air, it is very difficult to pay attention to the large shapes and to minimize it into maybe 3 or 4 or 5. So here's a trick. Take a picture with your phone or whatever device you want, an iPad even, and then look at the picture. The picture will immediately squeeze all of the view that you're looking at into a small frame, and you'll have a much easier time seeing these shapes. Because if you take this scene and you zoom in on all the buildings, all the boats, you will see a lot of details. You will see plenty of details, and you may feel the need to represent each and every one of those details. Don't be fooled by that. Don't let that fool you. Take a step back. Look at the scene in its entirety. By the way, I added markings for where I'm going to stop this wash of the water. I'm darkening it to make the highlight pop more. Okay, so this is what I just did. But don't be fooled by all the small details. Take a few steps back physically, squint your eyes, you will see the main details that are required. And here's a good guideline for you. If you're struggling to get it under 5 or 6 shapes, you're doing something wrong. If you're seeing like 12 or 20 shapes, you're focused on way too many details, assuming our goal is to simplify. If you want to get all those details in, get a more photorealistic rendering of a scene, feel free to. But we're talking about simplification here, okay? So now look at what happens. I'm adding a slightly darker touch to the water, did it wet on dry, and that really brings out the highlight in the middle. And now we're off to working on our pretty much last shape, which is the gondolas. And I treat them all as one shape, one big shape. Not necessarily by connecting them, because I won't connect them, there will be some gaps, but by using the same value and mix of colors, okay? And talking about colors, what am I using here? a bit of blue, a bit of red, a bit of yellow, all together, mixed thickly to create this thick mix that you can really see. And look at, once I place the gondolas, the difference it makes in the layers. It makes them pop forward. Because so far the background layer was the darkest thing, and it's all contextual in watercolor. Okay, so I'm using the same kind of mixture, interpreting the gondolas into two shapes, the darks and the highlights on them. And that's it. Okay, so the gondolas could be treated actually as two shapes, but it's fine. It's one, because the highlights are created by the washes underneath. Okay, if that makes sense. So I'm looking at each gondola individually, but I'm treating them as one big kind of foreground shape, if you will. Now look at me go. I'm just rendering the details I see on them. And I'm basically, again, everything that's light, I'm skipping and letting the layers underneath be that. And everything that's dark, I'm placing it in. Now, if your drawing was accurate as you could, this stage will really close things up in a nice way. If your drawing is not as accurate, it will challenge you to this idea that I mentioned earlier. As long as you place things in the general right place, take a few steps back from your painting. If it makes sense in that regard, it will look good. Because look at how I render these. I don't put in all of the details. I'm not 100% accurate. I'm actually quite off in many regards. But the general placement of the boats is clear. The water, the idea of the three large shapes that preceded the boats, which is the sky, buildings, and water, works well. And you don't need good drawing skills for those, because again, these are very abstract shapes. As long as these are in the right place, these boats are going to tell the story. Now, under the boats, we have those ripples. And remember what I said? I'm including them as a intrinsic part of the boats. Why? Because they're the same value. That's how I decided to unify them. Look at them. They're just the same value, dark and dark. So I'm connecting them together. And you will be surprised at just how important these ripples and shadows in the water are. Because that's what anchors the boats to the water's surface. That's what tells the viewer these are boats. And these random patterns are key for getting that organic feeling. Practice those. You may not get them right the first time. That's perfectly fine. You want to practice those. You want to do a lot of kind of ripples on just a test paper, if you will, and get these down. You will be able to learn how to render these properly. Same goes for these poles that come out of the water. Same thing. Use these very abstract, rippley shapes to describe them. That's how I approach these. And if you combine all of these elements together, you will get a painting that is simplified in terms of the shapes and the details. Again, focus on fewer shapes. The reason I'm repeating this is that that's all there is to it. If you're struggling and you're looking at it and you're like, well, I have at least 12. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 12. You're doing something wrong. Take a few steps back and really look at it carefully in that light. If you had to minimize it to just 3 shapes, what would you do? And that's your answer. Now, I almost am finished with the painting. One last thing and this shows you have to react to what happens on paper. One thing that really stuck out to me is the need for, first, some opaque paint for the highlights, and second, to bring the water together. Because I added this very dark shape in the foreground, the water itself is missing just a few darker ripples to it. Under the boats, in the foreground, and in the background. Okay, everywhere. So I'm just doing that. I'm just adding these shapes in. I may need to add more of these, but yeah, that's just the general idea here. Once we finish with those, we can add that opaque paint I was telling you about. Now this is really cool because we can use this as means to lighten everything up that needs lightening, not only to add highlights. So I'm using it to design the edges of the highlights on the water surface. If I missed a few key highlights or the shape doesn't feel exactly right, I'm just putting in a few lines and making it look right. I'm using it to make a separation between the boats in the foreground and the slightly mid-value background. I'm using it to bring back some of the windows on the background's structure. I'm using it for everything that has to do with lightening things up, making them lighter, basically. And look at how it really ties everything in together. One thing I am recognizing is that I may need to add a few more ripples in the water's foreground in a few moments. Okay, you will see me probably do that kind of a thing. I'm signing this prematurely. You will see me do that. But that is really what it's all about. And if it sounds too easy to be true, it actually is as easy. Okay, now, one quick note about that. If you choose scenes that are against the light, you'll have an easier time doing that. Because scenes that are against the light, which are very popular in watercolor painting, very naturally produce a clear layering. You get a background that's kind of hazy and light. You get a foreground and a middle ground, and these all work in tandem from light to dark. Here's the final result. Now let's wrap it up.
I hope you enjoyed this demo. Now, a couple of important notes. This has a lot to do with personal style. You may decide that you really enjoy showing more of the details, or you may enjoy dropping a lot of them. You may have fun merging a bunch of shapes and using perhaps soft edges to convey their connection, or you may decide to work on multiple smaller shapes. You choose how to simplify, but the key here is, remember, think about large shapes and how you can connect them together to have fewer of them, and then within those try and see how many details you can get away with having, and that's how you stretch your abilities of simplifying shapes and details. I hope that makes sense. I hope you enjoyed this one, and once you're ready, let's move on to the next lesson.